Today is November 9th, 2025. The conflict in Ukraine continues. I want to show you two maps to get you up to speed regarding what is actually happening on the battlefield. And then I want to go into the narratives that we see being presented by the Western media that many analysts, and these are good analysts and they're honest analysts, they're going through these narratives being presented by the Western media without connecting it to the first principles that this whole conflict is based on. So I want to show an example of an article presented by the Western media of a story about something that almost certainly never happened. And I want to show people how you can use first principles to see through these narratives so that you can discard them, or at least put them in their proper perspective. Because of course, you don't necessarily need to discard false narratives. You can examine the false narrative and try to discern what it is that the Western media, and of course the special interests that drive Western foreign and domestic policy, what it is they're trying to convince us is happening, why they're trying to convince us that is what's happening. So that actually can be useful information to use in analysis. Anyway, let's go to the first map. This is the map that I always show. This is liveuamap.com. It is essentially the visual representation of the Ukraine General Staff. This is what they are pretending is happening on the battlefield. And I show people this map specifically because despite it being extremely biased in favor of Ukraine, it is still showing a dire situation for Ukraine's armed forces and of course their US, European sponsors. So let's look at the map. Of course, you can see these red logos deep inside Ukrainian territory and including these electric signs. This is owed to Russia's frequent and increasingly larger scale drone and missile strikes all across Ukraine on rail infrastructure, energy infrastructure, the electric grid, and this is having a serious impact on Ukraine's infrastructure. And of course, Ukraine is doing the exact same thing back to Russia, but in a very limited area. And of course, again, that's Ukraine, and that is Russia. And Russia is just so much larger, its infrastructure spread out so much further. The hundreds, thousands of drones and missiles that Russia is using to degrade Ukraine's infrastructure is having an impact, but just imagine how many more drones and missiles would be required to have the same impact on Russia, its economy, its infrastructure. So it's just something to keep in mind, to put it into perspective. Let's look at the actual front line. So we have the line of contact stretching from here in the south, Kherson, along the Dnieper River to Zaporozhye. And then in the Donetsk, Donbass region, we have Pokrovsk, which even this pro-Ukrainian map shows Russian forces having almost at least half control over the actual city of Pokrovsk. And you can see a semi-encirclement taking place. And even if this was real, if this was really where the line of contact was, this is a very small distance. There are many Russian weapon systems that can bridge this gap, especially drones and artillery, that could effectively, operationally cut all of the Ukrainian forces in this area off from reinforcements and from logistics. And here we have Mirnograd. This is right next, side by side with Pokrovsk. And this is essentially it being encircled by Russian forces. If we go up further north, Konstantinovka, again, this pro-Ukrainian map shows Russian forces in the southeastern area of Konstantinovka. They're not along the edge of this area. They're now working their way into the actual urban built-up area. Then we have Seversk. Again, this pro-Ukrainian map shows Russian forces right at the edge of Seversk. And Lyman, and I've talked about this in a previous video. I'll zoom out and show you the map again. Russian forces are extending out to do the same to Lyman. One more before I zoom out on the whole on the whole area of operation. Here's Kupiansk. This is in Kharkov. And even this pro-Ukrainian map shows Russian forces holding almost half of Kupiansk. If we zoom out and we look at what Russia is doing here, they're going to consolidate control over this entire area. Once they have Pokrovsk and Mirnograd, they're going to consolidate control over all of this area. They are pushing westward. They will do so in a way that will not leave them exposed to counterattack and encirclement themselves. But what their primary objective almost certainly is to now begin cutting off Kramatorsk, Slavyansk, and advancing on them. When, I wouldn't say if, when they take Liman and Seversk, and because they are consolidating control here in the south, just their drone forces, if concentrated in the rear of Kramatorsk and Slavyansk, they can bridge this distance and they can begin operationally isolating the Ukrainian forces operating in this entire area. And this will create an operational crisis for Ukrainian forces, and inevitably this area will fall to Russian forces, and the entire Donbas region will be under the control of Russia. And that is one of several of their primary objectives for launching the special military operation in the first place. That would be a major victory for Russia, and it doesn't appear that there's anything Ukraine and its US sponsors can do to stop it, except try to freeze the conflict and essentially affect a Minsk 3.0 framework, which is what the Biden administration had been working on and what the Trump administration, even during campaign season, said they were going to do. They were never going to actually end this conflict. They simply want to freeze it. Now let's look at another map. This map is by Scott of Kalibrated, and I will put the link to it in the video description below. And actually, when you look at it, there are some major differences, but there are a lot of similarities with the Ukrainian liveUAmap.com. I want to show you what is much more likely taking place in the Pokrovsk, Mirnograd area. Almost all of Pokrovsk city is taken by Russian forces, and Mirnograd is much more encircled and in much dire straits than the other map is showing. You can see this orange area. This is basically the gap that is being left for Ukrainian soldiers. And again, at this distance here, much shorter than the one depicted here, many, many more weapon systems, mortars, drones, artillery, anti-tank guided missiles, probably even some heavy guns, tanks. They can bridge this gap, and virtually nothing is going to get in or out in any sort of significant volume. If we go up to Seversk, very similar to what the pro-Ukrainian map was showing. Liman, on the other hand, that is another story. Liman is another story. Russian forces are being shown as being right up to the edge of the built-up urban area, which means the Russians are making much more progress against Liman than the pro-Ukrainian map is showing. And up here in Kupiansk and Kharkov region, they show Russian forces pushing much further south and having enveloped all of this area of Kupiansk. Here, and of course, what you see here is another major encirclement. Okay, so I will put the link to that map in the video description below, and you can just type in liveUAmap.com, and then you can look at this map and you can compare and contrast on your own. The basic conclusion you can draw by looking at either one of these maps is that Russian forces continue to advance. There are several major, I would say they're all major cities. Some of these are very small cities, but they are heavily fortified. They are important strategically for Ukraine's front line, and they are being encircled, and they are in the process of collapsing. And this is what I've been warning about taking place for the last 3 years. I talked about the inability for the US to provide enough arms and ammunition to Ukraine, and the critical manpower crisis that would not just continue to get worse, but would continue to do so exponentially. Building up a military, building up a, say, a brigade of some 4,000 men is not about finding 4,000 men, giving them basic training, handing them a rifle, and sending them into battle. It is much more complicated than that. A brigade of 4,000 men could take anywhere between 2 to 3 years to properly prepare for battle. And that's if you have non-commissioned officers and officers capable of leading the subunits that are within a brigade. And of course, Ukraine doesn't have any of this manpower. And so as their units are diminishing, they're losing officers, they're losing non-commissioned officers, they're depending more and more on just entry-level recruits who just simply don't have the skills, the training, the experience necessary to operate effectively on the battlefield. And they're going up against a Russian military that is capable of reconstituting its forces with properly trained manpower, both entry-level and the officers required to lead these men in battle. So this is a mismatch that is only going to get worse over time. Russia continues to expand its military power in terms of arms, ammunition, trained manpower, and Ukraine continues to contract. And as they do, the line of contact is going to begin moving quicker and quicker. And then there will eventually be a general collapse, what I've been warning about for quite some time now. Now I want to talk about this other topic, this necessity to have a solid foundation of first principles to do analysis so that you can sift through the deliberately deceptive narratives the Western media constantly presents to the public. This is an article, somewhat older, October 21st, 2025, but you'll still see articles like this being presented to the public to try to convince people that the US is somehow trying to mediate the conflict between Russia and Ukraine rather than overseeing it and deliberately perpetuating it while simply pretending to want some sort of peace. When in reality, they just want to freeze the conflict because of all of the factors that I was just discussing in terms of Ukraine's inevitable collapse. So this is how Trump-Zelensky meeting turned acrimonious over demands for territorial concessions. Now, did this meeting even take place? I don't know. Were any of these things said? Maybe. Here's the first thing you need to understand. I will read a couple of quotes from this article. Here's something you have to understand. US President Donald Trump doesn't know anything and he's not in charge of anything. He literally thinks the S in BRICS is Spain. So what do you think he actually knows about what's going on in Ukraine? What do you think he knows about ending this conflict if he even wanted to, which he obviously doesn't, and which he has actually told us himself that he doesn't want to, he wants to freeze it. And President Volodymyr Zelensky of Ukraine, he is not a politician, he is not a military man. He was a clown. He was a comedian who simply played a politician in a comedy movie, and then special interests backed by the US groomed him, presented him to the public, baited and switched on their campaign promises, saying that they would achieve peace with Russia before just ramping everything up to provoke this proxy war that we are now in the middle of. So he is not in charge of anything. So what could President Zelensky and President Trump possibly be arguing about when neither one of them knows anything that's going on in Ukraine and when neither one of them is in charge of anything that actually happens in Ukraine or in the United States? President Donald Trump's working lunch with his Ukrainian counterpart, Volodymyr Zelensky, turned acrimonious when the US leader insisted Ukraine make territorial concessions to Russia to end the war, according to European officials briefed on the meeting. So just right there, that should be a warning. European officials briefed on the meeting. They weren't at the meeting. They were simply briefed on the meeting. Who told them this? Did they tell them the truth? Trump, who would later endorse a freeze in current battle lines. So that's Minsk 3.0, and Russia has categorically rejected that. It doesn't matter what territorial concessions you make to Russia. If you're just going to freeze the conflict, rebuild Ukraine's armed forces, and start this all over again, just like the Minsk 1 and Minsk 2 agreements, then Russia's not interested for obvious reasons. So Trump, who would later endorse a freeze in current battle lines as part of a peace settlement, grew frustrated and raised his voice multiple times, the officials said. Again, officials who weren't there, who have no idea what actually took place, if anything even did take place. Then it says, according to European officials, again, Are these reliable sources? I would say almost certainly not. Zelensky and his delegation came to the White House with maps showing current battle lines, hoping to convince the US president to maintain and expand American support. Trump seemed uninterested in the arguments and forcibly insisted Ukraine agree to land concessions for the war to end, they said. Now, I'm going to explain to you why that is absolute nonsense. And those familiar with my analysis of the conflict in Ukraine probably already know where I'm going with this. The Western media itself, over the last couple of years, has admitted that Ukraine was politically captured by the United States, so that the government no longer is truly Ukrainian. There is no sovereignty in the Ukrainian government has no sovereignty. It's in charge of absolutely nothing. It serves US interests, even at the expense of Ukraine's interests, including its own self-preservation. We know, because the Western media has admitted this, that from 2014 onward, the Central Intelligence Agency, CIA, took over all of Ukraine's intelligence agencies. We also know that the US military began rebuilding, reorganizing, arming Ukraine's armed forces from 2014 onward. And from 2022 onward, the US military actually commanded Ukrainian troops. They oversaw absolutely everything. They were at the top of the chain of command. The top Ukrainian commanders were subordinate to US commanders who are operating out of Germany. So essentially, the narrative in this article is utterly divorced from reality. Now, a honest and exceptional analyst can look at this article, they can read through it, and then take the information presented at face value, draw completely logical, rational, well thought out, convincing conclusions. But because the article itself is divorced from reality, all of those conclusions will likewise be divorced from reality. This is why you need first principles. All first principles means is you take any particular subject and you break it down to its most basic verifiable components. What do we actually know about this conflict in Ukraine? So I talked about the US political capture of Ukraine. We have this article from all the way back in 2004, US campaign behind the turmoil in Kiev. So 2014 wasn't the first time the US tried to overthrow the government in Ukraine. Again, I've brought this article up many times before. My apologies, but I want to be thorough here. The campaign is an American creation, a sophisticated and brilliantly conceived exercise in Western branding and mass marketing that in 4 countries, not just Ukraine, 4 countries in 4 years, has been used to try to salvage rigged elections and topple unsavory regimes. And by that, they mean elections that didn't turn out the way the US wanted them to. Had nothing to do with the actual legitimacy of these elections. Funded and organized by the US government, deploying US consultancies, pollsters, diplomats, and the 2 big American parties, and US non-governmental organizations, which they mean the US government created, funded, and overseen National Endowment for Democracy and all of its subsidiaries, which they mention by name later on in this article. The campaign was first used in Europe in Belgrade in 2000 to beat Slobodan Milosevic at the ballot box. Richard Miles, U.S. ambassador in Belgrade, played a key role. And by last year, U.S. ambassador in Tbilisi, Georgia, repeated the trick. They overthrew the government there, and they put Mikhail Saakashvili into power. And that was a trial run for what they would do in Ukraine 2014 onward. They overthrew the Georgian government in 2003. They reorganized, rebuilt the Georgian military, armed it, gave them US-style weapons and uniforms. And then they told them to go and attack Russia. That was the 2008 Georgia-Russian war. Russia soundly defeated Georgia. And then after that, the U.S. pretended to want to restart its relationship with Russia. Does that sound like something familiar that you might have heard recently? 10 months after the success in Belgrade, U.S. ambassador in Minsk, Michael Kozak, a veteran of similar operations in Central America, notably in Nicaragua. So they admit they're talking about 4 countries in 4 years in and around Europe. But they're also talking about multiple other regime change operations the U.S. has oversaw all around the globe, including in Latin America. They organized a near identical campaign to try to defeat the Belarus hardman Alexander Lukashenko. That one failed. The operation, engineering democracy through the ballot box and civil disobedience. So basically, meddling in other people's elections and putting mobs out into the street, violent mobs out into the street to essentially effect a coup, is now so slick that the methods have matured into a template for winning other people's elections. Does that sound democratic to you? Certainly not. So they're admitting the US has a global spanning network through the National Endowment for Democracy, its subsidiaries, and adjacent organizations like George Soros' Open Society. They target these countries, they undermine sitting governments, they build up an opposition that serves US interests at the expense of the interests of the targeted country. They eventually overthrow, often violently, overthrow these governments. Dozens, scores, hundreds of people are killed in these regime change operations. And then they politically capture the whole country and they run it right into the ground. They'll turn it into a battering ram to use against another US adversary. They will just strip mine it of resources and human capital, or they will stitch it into an organization like the European Union and NATO, which again is a parasitic function of American empire that usurps the interests of the countries that are part of these so-called alliances or unions. They did this in 2004, and then exactly what they are admitting in this article in 2004, they did again in 2014. It was the exact same process. In 2014, they succeeded. Why? Why did they want to overthrow the Ukrainian government? I mean, we know now it's very obvious, but why did they want to overthrow the Ukrainian government? And we know this 2019 Rand Corporation paper, Extending Russia Competing from Advantageous Ground, explains exactly why the US wanted to take over Ukraine. What they had planned for Ukraine would never be possible if a government in Ukraine was actually tied to Ukraine's best interests. If they were tied to Ukraine's best interests and the US said, please start a war with neighboring Russia, they would obviously say, no, we're not interested in that. We're not even interested in allowing you to come into our country, interfere with our military, our sovereign institutions, to create the possibility of doing that, because that would just provoke Russia. And that does not serve our best interests. That only serves your interests. This is why regime change is necessary. This is why the US overthrows governments all around the world, to compel the captured nation to do things it otherwise would never accept doing. So this 2019 paper, Extending Russia, has a table of contents that I've shown my audience many, many times. The geopolitical measures. Number one, provide lethal aid to Ukraine. They were trying to provoke a proxy war with Russia. Increase support to the Syrian rebels. Of course, they're doing all of these things at the same time to extend Russia. And it worked. By providing lethal aid to Ukraine and provoking the war that followed in 2022, Russia was stretched thin, and their ability to protect the Syrian government resulted in the US finally successfully overthrowing the Syrian government. Al-Qaeda literally runs Syria right now. They're handing over territory and bases to both Israel and their US sponsors. Promote regime change in Belarus. They were talking about that in 2004 in that Guardian article. Exploit tensions in the South Caucasus, Azerbaijan, and Armenia. We see how that is turning out. Reduce Russian influence in Central Asia. Challenge Russian presence in Moldova. Absolutely every single one of these measures has been in the works and continues to be pursued by the current US government under the Trump administration right now. Just picked up exactly where the Biden and Obama administrations left off. But of course, there's the economic measures: hinder petroleum exports, reduce natural gas exports, and hinder pipeline expansion, or just blow them up. Impose sanctions, enhance Russian brain drain. Again, all things the US government has been and continues to do to this day. If the Trump administration really wanted peace with Russia, why are they continuing absolutely every single one of these economic and geopolitical measures? Ask yourself that. But let's get to the crux of all of this. They have the benefits and the risks of providing lethal aid to Ukraine. I will read you the benefits. Expanding U.S. assistance to Ukraine, including lethal military assistance, remember, this is 2019, would likely increase the costs to Russia in both blood and treasure of holding the Donbas region. More Russian aid to the separatists and an additional Russian troop presence would likely be required, leading to larger expenditures, equipment losses, and Russian casualties, the latter could become quite controversial at home, as it did when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan. Of course, they're admitting they want to expand the conflict in Ukraine. They want to draw Russia into a war, just like the US and the CIA, the US intelligence agencies, did in Afghanistan in the 1980s. Now, they also talked about the risks, the cost. Who would bear the cost of this? Would the US bear the cost of this? No, certainly not. It would be the Ukrainians. Alternatively, and most certainly, as history has now proven, Russia might counter-escalate, committing more troops and pushing them deeper into Ukraine. I was just showing you the map. Look how far into Ukraine they are now. Russia might even preempt U.S. action, escalating before any additional U.S. aid arrives. Such escalation might extend Russia. Eastern Ukraine is already a drain. So that is a positive for the U.S. Taking more of Ukraine might only increase the burden, albeit at the expense of the Ukrainian people, which the U.S. doesn't care about, because that is why you politically capture and use a nation as a proxy in the first place. They bear the cost of your foreign policy, not you. You only reap the benefits. However, such a move might also come at a significant cost to Ukraine and to U.S. prestige and credibility. This could produce disproportionately large Ukrainian casualties, which it now has, territorial losses. We are watching with our own eyes those territorial losses increase exponentially, and refugee flows, which we now can see numbers in the millions. It might even lead Ukraine into a disadvantageous peace, which is why President Trump and before him President Biden tried to freeze the war, because they are losing it. There will be a disadvantageous peace for Ukraine, which will reflect poorly on the US and NATO. It would also allow Russia to free up its resources and counter all of those other measures you see in the Rand Corporation paper that the US is needling Russia through. They will be able to use resources to confront and overcome those other pressure points. That's why they want to keep this war going or freeze it and maintain a looming threat that Russia will have to keep resources tied up to face. So again, we're talking about first principles, the basic fundamentals of this conflict in Ukraine. The US deliberately overthrew the Ukrainian government, politically captured the government. It no longer serves Ukrainian interests. It has no sovereignty. It solely serves US interests. So how can the president of this government that is completely captured and working for the US come to the White House and argue with the US president about anything? Just ask yourself that question. And we know that the US overthrew the government of Ukraine specifically to use it as a battering ram against Russia. That is the whole purpose of this war. The US isn't aiding Ukraine in some war that was sparked between Ukraine and Russia independently, and the US is intervening. They engineered this war deliberately for this purpose. Let's keep going. Let's look at this. The New York Times, February 2024, the spy war, how the CIA secretly helps Ukraine fight Putin for more than a decade. So long before the special military operation began, the United States has nurtured a secret intelligence partnership with Ukraine that is now critical for both countries in countering Russia. The article goes on and says, now entering its third year of a war that has claimed hundreds of thousands of lives, the intelligence partnership between Washington and Kiev is a linchpin of Ukraine's ability to defend itself, or in other words, fight America's proxy war for it. The CIA and other American intelligence agencies provide intelligence for targeted missile strikes, track Russian troop movements, and help support spy networks. And they also create and train and direct these spy networks. In other words, the CIA is running absolutely every aspect of Ukraine's intelligence operations. It is a CIA operation. It's an extension of the CIA at this point. But the partnership is no wartime creation, nor is Ukraine the only beneficiary. It took root a decade ago, coming together in fits and starts under three very different US presidents. Continuity of agenda, keep that in mind. Pushed forward by key individuals who often took daring risks. It has transformed Ukraine, whose intelligence agencies were long seen as thoroughly compromised by Russia, into one of Washington's most important intelligence partners against the Kremlin today. And they have to say that they're partners, because if they said they are just simply an extension of the CIA, that wouldn't go down well with the public. Again, the Western media's goal is to present to you narratives to manipulate public perception, not inform the public of reality. It also talks about a CIA-supported network of spy bases constructed in the past 8 years. Again, this is 2024. That include 12 secret locations along the Russian border. Imagine if it was the other way around. Russia violently overthrew the Canadian government, reorganized its military, armed them with Russian-built, manufactured weapons and ammunition, and then was building KGB installations along the border with the United States. How would that go down? Would that be a national security threat that the Americans would have to respond to, or would the Americans be unreasonable to see that as a threat? It also talks about how the CIA began training an elite Ukrainian commando force. Now, commandos use lethal force. They go over borders and they kill people from other countries. So the CIA was training Ukrainian commando forces that would cross the border into Russia and kill Russians. Again, imagine if it was the other way around. The unit known as 2245, which captured Russian drones and communication gear so the CIA technicians could reverse engineer them and crack Moscow's encryption systems. And of course, one of the officers in that unit was Kirilo Bundanov, who is now the general leading Ukraine's military intelligence, nominally leading it, because again, of course, the CIA is running all of this. He is the head Ukrainian liaison for the CIA running Ukrainian intelligence. And the CIA also helped train a new generation of Ukrainian spies who operate inside Russia, across Europe, and in Cuba and other places where the Russians have a large presence. So of course, you have to remember, the US military was also in Ukraine from 2014 onward. We remember them setting up bases in Western Ukraine, training centers to reorganize and train Ukraine up to NATO standards. They did that for 8 years, and they bragged about that in the opening phase of Russia's special military operation, saying how all of that training, preparation, President Donald Trump during his first term beginning to arm Ukraine with Western weapons, how all of that contributed to blunting Russia's initial incursion into Ukraine, which to some degree is true. However, we know from 22 onward, the US has been just openly running directing Ukraine's armed forces. We know that because the New York Times admitted that too. The Partnership, The Secret History of the War in Ukraine. This is from March 2025, so just earlier this year. I'm actually going to read a lot from this article. This is a little bit of an older article. I reference it often, but I don't really dig into it deeply each time. I think you will see that the degree to which the New York Times admits, and which is obvious to anyone who understands military matters, you understand that Ukraine is not doing any of this on their own. It's impossible. Only the US has the capability to do any of this and enable any of this. And so that's how you have to approach Western media reports. Is anything they're saying actually plausible? If President Zelensky is not in charge of anything happening in Ukraine, why is he arguing with President Trump, who's also not in charge of anything happening in the United States? How is that? That's not a rational narrative. Doesn't make sense. Does not add up. The New York Times admitting that the US is basically running Ukraine's armed forces, that is entirely rational. Logical is really the only explanation that accounts for what is happening in Ukraine right now. Now, of course, not everything that this New York Times article says adds up, and maybe I'll get into a little bit of that. So it starts, it says, America was woven into the war far more intimately and broadly than previously understood. Well, myself, Alex and Alexander de Duran, many other analysts actually from the very beginning understood the US was basically running and directing everything, that it would be impossible for Ukraine to do any of these things all on their own. It was obvious this was happening, which is why when the New York Times admitted it, it was significant, because it was telling us things that we already suspected, but we just didn't have any, absolute proof. Now the Western media is admitting it. Now it's very hard for people to deny that this is a reality. The partnership was a backbone of Ukrainian military operations that US counts have killed or wounded more than 700,000 Russian soldiers. Ukraine has put its casualty toll at 435,000, which is absurd. Side by side in Wiesbaden's Mission Command Center, that is in Germany, American and Ukrainian officers planned Kiev's counteroffensives, plural. So every single counteroffensive was planned by US generals. And then the plans were given to the Ukrainian generals to implement on the battlefield, with US support at every step of the way. A vast American intelligence collection effort, again, going back to the other New York Times article admitting the CIA took over Ukraine's intelligence operations from 2014 onward. Those efforts both guided big picture battle strategy and funneled precise targeting information down to Ukrainian soldiers in the field. So the US was doing big picture strategy across the entire theater and even beyond. They're also picking and targeting specific units on the battlefield, Russian targets on the battlefield. One European intelligence chief recalled being taken aback to learn how deeply enmeshed his NATO counterparts had become in Ukrainian operations. They are part of the kill chain now, he said. Of course, how could you be a European intelligence chief and not understand that what Ukraine was doing would only be possible with American intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance? How could you not already discern that from just the way the battle was unfolding? Now, regarding the nature of involvement of both the U.S. military, but also the CIA. So again, this article will build on what the other New York Times article admitted regarding the CIA. It says, the partners set their sights on the Crimean port of Sevastopol. Remember, we heard about Ukraine's plan to seize or drive the Russians out of Crimea. None of this was ever Ukraine's plan. This was all America's planning and strategy, but they have to say that it's Ukraine's to create plausible deniability, the illusion of a degree of separation between the US supporting Ukraine and Ukrainians fighting the US proxy war on Washington's behalf, where the Russian Black Sea Fleet loaded missiles destined for Ukrainian targets onto warships and submarines. At the height of Ukraine's 2022 counteroffensive, a pre-dawn swarm of maritime drones with support from the Central Intelligence Agency attacked the port, damaging several warships and prompting the Russians to begin pulling them back. But of course, the Kaliber cruise missile can be fired from anywhere in the Black Sea and still hit any target inside of Ukraine. So there's that. Ultimately, the partnership strained and the arc of the war shifted amid rivalries, resentments, and diverging imperatives and agendas. Of course, this is where I mentioned the article says things that do not add up. If you read this article, there's scapegoating taking place. The U.S. grand strategy was fundamentally flawed. And we remember U.S. and British generals talking about, the 2023 Ukrainian offensive, how great it was going to be, how the Russian forces would just buckle and flee. And I explained in great detail how ridiculous that was, how that was never going to happen. Surely they knew that was never going to happen. But of course, the whole goal of this war is not for Ukraine to win. It never was about Ukraine winning or saving Ukraine. It was always about extending Russia. So how do you convince everyone in Ukraine to continue fighting a futile war that is designed solely to extend Russia at the expense of Ukraine's very existence? Again, the 2019 paper admits that Ukraine will almost certainly lose the war. How do you convince them to keep going? You lie about it and you say, this counteroffensive is going to deliver victory to Ukraine. We will be by you for as long as it takes. These are the things you say to keep fueling a futile proxy war. This is how you get other human beings to do your bidding. You have to lie to them. If they told them the truth, they would not have gotten involved in this in the first place. The Ukrainians sometimes saw the Americans as overbearing and controlling because they were running the entire war. The prototypical patronizing Americans. The Americans sometimes couldn't understand why the Ukrainians didn't simply accept good advice. Well, there's accepting good advice and then there's the realities of implementing it. I'm sure they accepted all of America's directives. They simply had no means of implementing them because of the US's inability to supply the proper amount of arms and ammunition and to enable Ukraine to constitute enough trained manpower to actually operate on the battlefield with those arms and ammunition. Then they talk about ATACMS. And remember, when they're talking about ATACMS, you can use this same reality in regards to every other weapon system the US has sent to Ukraine or is contemplating sending to Ukraine. We are always told that it's President Volodymyr Zelensky begging the US for these weapons and the US reluctantly giving them to the Ukrainians. The New York Times article admits what we all should already know. It's the US idea to send these weapons to Ukraine. They obviously can't say that because, again, it is a proxy war. They're supposed to be helping the Ukrainians, not running the war and fighting the Russians with just the fig leaf of it being laundered through the Ukrainians. The previous year, the Russians had unwisely placed command posts, ammunition depots, and logistics centers within 50 miles of the front lines. And they're talking about how the US then supplied HIMARS to Ukraine. That was America's idea. That was their plan. They saw all of these targets. The HIMARS could hit them. Every single aspect of HIMARS operations are enabled by the US, if not even by US contractors. And then Russia moved everything back. But new intelligence showed that the Russians have now moved critical installations beyond HIMARS reach. So Generals Kavoli and Aguta, those are Ukrainian names, those are American generals, recommended the next quantum leap, giving the Ukrainians Army tactical missile systems, missiles known as ATACMS, that can travel up to 190 miles to make it harder for Russian forces in Crimea to help defend Melitopol. And this was during the catastrophic failed 2023 offensive. Again, completely planned by the US, overseen and directed by US generals in Germany, with Ukrainian commanders as their subordinates. The Americans now presented Mr. Zelensky with what they believed would constitute a statement victory, a bombing campaign using long-range missiles and drones to force the Russians to pull their military infrastructure out of Crimea and back into Russia. It would be codenamed Operation Lunar Hail. Until now, the Ukrainians, with help from the CIA and the US and British navies, had used maritime drones together with long-range British Storm Shadow and French Scalp missiles to strike the Black Sea Fleet. Weissenbaden's contribution was intelligence. And of course, all of this, British, French, all of this European support for the war is being done under NATO, which is ultimately commanded and overseen and directed by the US. But to prosecute the wider Crimea campaign, the Ukrainians would need far more missiles. They would need hundreds of ATACMS. And of course, they set a small number, and then they expanded the number, and that was because of the necessities laid out by US objectives, not Ukrainian demands for additional missiles. At the Pentagon, the old cautions hadn't melted away, but after General Aguto briefed Mr. Austin on all that Lunar Hail could achieve, again, it's a US general talking to the US Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, an aide recalled, he said, okay, there's really compelling strategic objectives here. It isn't just about striking things. So it was a US plan. It required US weapons that hadn't been sent to Ukraine yet, that would be very provocative, dangerously escalating the whole conflict with Russia. And it was the US that was compelled to send those weapons to Ukraine. And of course, Ukraine wasn't going to do anything at all with these weapons unless the US helped at every step of the way, bringing them in, setting them up, training people to, basically just push the button, but also to process all of the intelligence the US would be gathering and sending from Germany, and also picking the targets for those Ukrainian operators, if they even were Ukrainian, to push the button and hit those targets. It was, again, admittedly, it was the US at the top of this kill chain, operating everything, picking the targets, sending the weapons necessary to strike at them, providing the information to those units on the battlefield, and then striking those targets. Then they talk about targeting Russian territory itself with US weapons. Again, this was always something sold as Ukraine wanting to do, begging the US to let them, and then the US reluctantly let them. No, it was a US plan the entire time. Generals Kavoli and Aguta were tasked with creating an ops box, a zone on Russian soil in which the Ukrainians could fire US supplied weapons, and Weissenbaden could support their strikes. So again, entirely a US operation with just Ukrainians maybe pushing buttons to launch these weapons. At first, they advocated an expansive box to encompass a containment threat. The glide bombs, crude Soviet-era bombs transformed into precision weapons with wings and fins that were raining terror on Kharkov. A box extended about 190 miles would let the Ukrainians use their new ATACMS to hit glide bomb fields and other targets deep inside Russia. But Mr. Austin saw this as mission creep. He did not want to divert attackers from lunar hail. Now, do you understand? They're going to blame Ukraine for why all of this didn't work, but they just gave you a little hint as to why it really didn't work. The U.S. simply does not make enough arms and ammunition to implement the strategy the U.S. itself was coming up with to fight this proxy war against Russia through Ukraine. Instead, the generals were instructed to draw up two options, one extending about 50 miles into Russia, standard HIMARS range, and one nearly twice as deep. Ultimately, against the general's recommendation, Mr. Biden and his advisors chose the most limited option, but to protect the city of Sumy as well as Kharkov, it followed most of the country's northern border, encompassing an area almost as large as New Jersey. The CIA, there they are again, was also authorized to send officers to Kharkov region to assist their Ukrainian counterparts with the operations. So Americans involved literally on the battlefield, overseeing every aspect of this and implementing what the US generals in Germany were planning and demanded to be implemented. Then they talk about the 2023 offensive. And I know some people already know all of this, but it's important to refresh people's memory and to constantly reinforce first principles regarding this conflict so that when you see articles like this, you do not become distracted by these very tempting narratives, these very emotional narratives that really draw people as human beings into them. You use your knowledge of first principles regarding this conflict, and you're able to very easily see through these narratives. And then you can start asking yourself, why are they coming up with these narratives? What is it that they're trying to achieve by lying to us about this? You can completely dismiss it as any sense of truth, and you can start examining why we're being lied to instead, which is incredibly important. So the planning for 2023 began straight away. Every single year, the US was planning what Ukraine would do as part of carrying out their proxy war on their behalf. At what in hindsight was a moment of irrational exuberance. So because of what they feel like they achieved in 2022, they thought in 2023 they would be able to achieve maybe somehow a knockout blow, that maybe Russia really was weak enough where this analysis by the RAND Corporation all the way back in 2019, maybe it isn't true. Maybe Ukraine isn't consigned to some sort of disadvantageous peace. Or maybe this was just a lie, and this is much more likely. It's a lie being told to the Ukrainians to convince them to just keep fighting, no matter how futile it actually was in reality. And as a matter of fact, as they described the 2023 offensive, how it was planned and unfolded, you can see the US generals screaming at the Ukrainians to keep going, even though the Ukrainians themselves could see, we're not going to advance. The Russian defenses are too strong. We will never get through them. And all we will do is destroy our whole military. How are we supposed to fight next year if we continue on this year like this? And the Americans told them to keep going. And that was to raise the cost as high as possible for Russia, even if it meant doing it at the expense of Ukraine's very existence. Ukraine controlled the west banks of the Oskol and Dnieper rivers. Within the coalition, the prevailing wisdom was that the 2023 counteroffensive would be the war's last. Ukrainians would claim outright triumph, or Mr. Putin would be forced to sue for peace, or they would exhaust all their manpower and equipment, and then it would just be an expanding collapse from there on, which is what actually happened. Echoing 2022, the war games of January 2023 yielded a two-pronged plan. The secondary offensive by General Syrsky's forces in the east would be focused on Bakhmut, and the whole point was to tie up Russian forces elsewhere so that the Ukrainian forces pushing in the south toward the sea, the coast, they would have a better chance of succeeding. Of course, it didn't work out that way. And then the New York Times is lying about why it didn't work out, saying if only the Ukrainians listened to what the US was telling them to do. The counteroffensive was to begin on May 1st. The intervening months would be spent training for it. General Syrsky would contribute 4 battle-hardened brigades, each between 3,000 and 5,000 soldiers, for training in Europe. They would be joined by 4 brigades of new recruits. And I remember doing videos explaining how you cannot train brigades in the matter of a couple of months to do anything, really. That's not how it works. And so the very idea that they were doing this meant that they knew it wasn't going to work. They were doing as much as they could to raise the cost as high as possible for Russia, but this was never going to punch through Russian defenses and succeed. It never was. And I remember doing videos about this, and then I remember how it all unfolded exactly as I predicted, because that's how the military works. That's how military matters in the 21st century work. Let's talk about the US insisting Ukraine push on during the 2023 offensive, despite it obviously being doomed before it even began. So General Aguta yelled at the Ukrainian generals, press on, but the Ukrainians had to rotate troops from the front lines to the rear, and with only the 7 brigades, they weren't able to bring in new forces fast enough to keep going. The Ukrainian advance, in fact, was slowed by a mix of factors. Many of these factors I explained ahead of the 2023 offensive. And then eventually it was borne out that that is exactly what doomed it. Again, before it even started. So now here it becomes this process of scapegoating the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians would not make it to Melitopol. They never had a chance of making it to Melitopol. Never had a chance. They would have to scale back their ambitions. Now their objective would be small occupied city of Tokmak, about halfway to Melitopol, close to critical rail lines and railways. Again, even this made no sense at the time. I explained if they don't have enough troops to make it all the way to the coast, just pushing into Tokmak is just going to further exhaust what little Ukraine has left. And now there's a salient that Russia can cut off, encircle, and wipe out. General Aguta had given the Ukrainians greater autonomy, but now he crafted a detailed artillery plan, Operation Rolling Thunder, which I've mentioned in previous videos, and people point out that's just a recycled name that they actually used during the Vietnam War. That prescribed what the Ukrainians should shoot, with what and in what order, according to US and Ukrainian officials. So again, the kill chain that they mentioned in the beginning of the article, the US was running the entire thing, and the Ukrainians were just there as plausible deniability, the illusion of a degree of separation between the US and this war they're fighting against Russia. But these Ukrainian generals objected to some targets. They insisted on using drones to verify points of interest, and Rolling Thunder rumbled to a halt. I bet the real reason it rolled to a halt is because there wasn't enough ammunition. They even talk about that. Listen, okay, so they insisted on using the drones, and it rumbled to a halt. Desperate to salvage the counteroffensive, the White House had authorized secret transport of a small number of cluster warheads. So they're admitting they ran out of artillery ammunition. That's why it grinded to a halt. It wasn't because the Ukrainians verifying targets with drones. It's because there wasn't enough artillery ammunition to continue the campaign. And that's why they authorized the use of the cluster munitions, which were inappropriate for what they were trying to do, and a surprise, it didn't work. I remember talking about that too at the time. So then they talk about how the US helped Ukraine destroy 10 Russian helicopters, and that the Russians pulled their helicopters back. They were using them to wipe out entire columns of US, European supplied armor. You remember those pictures of the Ukrainian the US and European made tanks and infantry fighting vehicles and armored personnel carriers just sitting in the fields in heaps burning. You remember those images. Even though they were able to push the Russian helicopters back, so they claim, the Ukrainians still couldn't advance, again, because they didn't have the manpower or the ammunition to do it. So it wasn't a matter of what, it doesn't matter what you force the Russians to do. The Ukrainians simply don't have the manpower and arms and ammunition to punch through. The Americans' last-ditch recommendation was to have General Sursky take over the Tokmak fight. That was rejected. Then they proposed the General Sodoy send his Marines to Robotny and have them break through the Russian line. But instead, General Zaluzhny ordered the Marines to Kherson to open a new front in an operation the Americans consuled was doomed to fail, trying to cross the Dnieper and advance toward Crimea. The Marines made it across the river in early November, but ran out of men and ammunition. And if they ran out of men and ammunition over there, why wouldn't they have ran out of men and ammunition at Robotny, which they also did, by the way. The counteroffensive was supposed to deliver a knockout blow, and said it met an inglorious end, except we know that NATO was overseeing that operation, crossing the Dnieper at Kherson. We know that they were behind that operation also. So again, this is the scapegoating. Oh, the Ukrainians just went off on their own. They didn't listen to our great advice. That's why everything fell apart. They don't want to admit it. And that actually goes back to extending Russia, and where they admit that the conflict is going to cost America its reputation and its prestige. But not if you can scapegoat the Ukrainians and blame everything on them. We were going to win the conflict, but they just wouldn't listen to us. So that's how you salvage your credibility. Now that you understand all of this, in 2014, the US politically captured Ukraine. It no longer had a sovereign government making domestic or foreign policy serving Ukrainian interests. It now fully served Washington's interests, even at the cost of Ukraine itself. The US military, along with its European proxies, were literally inside Ukraine, reorganizing, rebuilding Ukraine's armed forces from 2014 onward. During the first Trump administration, the US began sending actual weapons to Ukraine's armed forces. The CIA from 2014 onward took over Ukraine's intelligence operations, directing absolutely everything. Building bases, CIA operatives on the ground in Ukraine along the Ukrainian-Russian border. And from 2022 onward, the CIA, together with the US military, they were picking targets both within Ukraine, where Russian forces had entered, but also deep inside Russia itself. And of course, now we hear about these drone strikes deep inside of Russia. Again, this is about plausible deniability and the illusion of a degree of separation. These drones are being funded and designed and built by the West. They are given to the Ukrainians. The intelligence for striking these targets deep inside Russia is coming from the United States. Who else? How else could it possibly be being done? And of course, US intelligence helps Ukraine target Russian energy infrastructure deep inside Russia with these drones. So by not using US missiles or rockets, by using these drones, they can pretend Ukraine is just making on their own. This gives them plausible deniability, a degree of separation between themselves in this war that the US is actually fighting against Russia directly, but just putting Ukraine in the middle for plausible deniability. And of course, keeping all of this in mind, we go back to this article, and then we can see how absolutely, utterly absurd the headline, all of the details in the article, if you just take it at face value, this is all based on some European official who wasn't even at the meeting. It's almost certain none of this actually even happened. And again, this is about shaping public perception. The US openly said, we want division of labor. We want Europe to take a more active role in holding Russia down in Ukraine, even if it means Europe going into Ukraine and ending up just like Ukraine, ending up destroying itself in this proxy war we are waging against Russia. We want to do strategic sequencing. We need to contain China before it becomes any stronger. We need to focus our resources on China, and we need all of these countries and regions that we have politically captured, including Europe, especially Europe. We need them to divert public funds away from social programs that European people actually need, infrastructures, social welfare programs, healthcare. Take money away from that and put it into the US proxy war in Ukraine. Keep Russia tied down while we take care of China. Division of labor, strategic sequencing. That is what the US is trying to do. If they can freeze the conflict in Ukraine, keep Russia tied up, and rebuild Ukraine's military under a ceasefire, just like Minsk I and Minsk II, that would be ideal. That's what they would ideally like to do. But at a minimum, they need to keep the conflict going, even if Ukraine is obviously losing, keep it going for as long as possible, raise the cost as high as possible for Russia. That is what the US aims to do. That is the plan. Articles like this are to distract us away from that reality, to make it look like it's Ukraine and even Europe who's being irrational. The US wants out, but Ukraine and Europe refuse to compromise. When going back to first principles, we know the US captured Ukraine. Ukraine's government is handpicked by the US government, serves the US at the expense of Ukraine. We know that for a fact. We know the CIA took over Ukrainian intelligence operations all the way back in 2014. We know the US military is running Ukraine's armed forces, so the US doesn't want out. They just want you to think they want out because they have a strategy of division of labor and strategic sequencing they need to sell, especially to the European public. The European public is going to have to make huge sacrifices it makes it easier for them to do it if they believe the US is abandoning them. And now it's up to them to save Ukraine and to save themselves from evil Russia. So that is what's going on. This is why it's important to always go back to first principles, to always break something down to the most basic, verifiable facts. You can apply first principles to geopolitical analysis anywhere in the world. The protests in Nepal, for example. Understanding first principles regarding any protest means understanding people don't just all come out of their house at the same time on the same day for the same reason. That never happens. It never happens. It's a fantasy. It never happens like that. There's always leadership, logistics, and money behind every single protest, good or bad. There are good protests with good people, with good leadership. They find the money, they raise the money, they create the logistics required for the protest, whether it's a good protest or one backed by foreign interests, like the National Endowment for Democracy. There is a definite footprint you can find and analyze. That's what you use first principles for. So if you were looking at Nepal and you've actually followed the money and you answered those questions, who's providing the leadership, the support in the media, the logistics, and where's all the money coming from? Who are all of these people being funded by? And you followed the money, you would have found that it was the National Endowment for Democracy, its subsidiaries, and all of its adjacent organizations like Open Society behind the entire protest. And yet there were people who were incapable of doing that because instead they read media headlines like that CNN article. They became engaged in it emotionally, ideologically, and they jumped to conclusions, or they were intent on just dishonestly deceiving their audiences in the first place, which is what most of the Western media and even some alternative media deliberately does. So this is why first principles are very important. It helps you cut through the narratives. It helps you short circuit your own emotional reaction to world events. We're human, we have emotions. It's a reality that we all have to overcome on a daily basis if we want to do real analysis. We cannot allow our emotions, our own personal political proclivities, blind us to what is actually happening. Committing yourself to building up solid first principle understanding of any geopolitical event is what allows you to build up a solid objective understanding of what's happening around the world. Understanding what is happening around the world gives you the ability to start thinking about solutions to what is happening all around the world. We all see something is happening that we don't want to see happening. How do we stop it? First, we have to understand it accurately, honestly, objectively. If you thought this video was useful, please like and share. Think about subscribing. It's free to do. It helps the channel grow. Check the video description below for other places you can find and follow my work. All of my videos go up on X, Telegram, Rumble, and YouTube. On YouTube, there's also a notification bell you can hit. You hit it, and then it'll alert you whenever I upload new videos. When you're waiting for me to upload new videos, if you go to my channel, you click on videos. These are all the videos, most recent to oldest. And then there's a section here called posts. If you click on here, these are posts that I put up over the week in between doing videos, and they cover a wide range of topics. This one, for example, U.S. stand and fight strategy amid Ukraine proxy war. It kind of connects to what I was talking about today. The whole point of the war in Ukraine is not to save Ukraine, is to extend Russia and to raise the cost as high as possible for Russia. So this is why the US generals running the Ukrainian armed forces don't actually care about whether these Ukrainian soldiers live or die. They just want them out there for as long as possible to slow Russia down for as long as possible and to raise the cost as high as possible. I have another post about Boeing. Boeing criminal case linked to deadly 737 crashes, plural, dropped. This is, of course, Boeing to maximize profits, cut corners on safety. Several planes crashed. Hundreds of people died. Innocent civilians died. The U.S. court was supposed to prosecute them. The U.S. government told them no. Why is that? Because this is who really runs the U.S. government, these corporations. They run the government, they fund the think tanks, They drive US foreign and domestic policy to serve their interests. Just like the US installs a client regime in Ukraine to serve their interests at the cost of Ukraine and the Ukrainian people's interests, these corporations in the United States put a government into power in Washington that serve their interests at the expense of the actual American people and their interests. So there will be posts like that on YouTube, also on X and Telegram, in between me posting up videos. In the video description below will be all of the links that I referenced in this video, as well as for ways you can help support my work. I do not monetize any of my social media platforms. If ads pop up, feel free to skip them, especially on Telegram. I don't know if ads pop up on my Telegram channel or not, but if you see some cryptocurrency pyramid scheme ad at the bottom of all of my posts, don't click on it unless you want to. It's not helping me out at all. If you do want to help support my work, please do so through Buy Me a Coffee and also through Patreon. The links are in the video description below this video. And to everyone who has been helping out, whether it's a one-time donation or donations month to month, or if you have no resources to spare at all and you're just helping share my work with others, or you're sending me news tips or kind comments or just liking and sharing, that all helps greatly. All of that is what makes this work possible. So I thank you sincerely, and as always, thank you for watching.